as I was saying, the poetry of Hafez occupies a unique position in Persian literature. There is near unanimity on his claim to be the greatest master of the Persian ghazal since the beginnings of this tradition over a millennium ago. While there is agreement on the greatness of Hafez, nevertheless, there is no consensus on the nature of his genius. While there has been a long tradition of interpreting the verse of Hafez in terms of Sufi mysticism, that model has been challenged by those who prefer to see Hafez in terms of secular courtly literature. Let me add that I use the term mysticism to translate irfan, a term that has a complicated history in Iran since the suppression of institutional Sufism in the 16th century. The debate that seeks to choose one side or the other on the issue of Hafez is overly simplified. However, a more nuanced view is provided by traditional commentaries, which present a hermeneutical approach that uses this poetry as a jumping-off point that evokes Sufi themes. But modern ideological shifts in Iran have produced blinders that make it difficult to understand what the traditional commentaries on Hafez are trying to do. Here I would like to examine the interpretive process of these commentaries and to clarify the causes of their incomprehensibility. Let's go to the next slide. The first section in my talk here is on the problem of mystical interpretation. The case against the Sufi interpretation of Hafez has been made in a prominent location, the introduction to a multi-part article on Hafez in the Encyclopedia Iranica, written by the chief editor, Ihsan Yarshater. He writes, "It was only natural that a Sufistic interpretation should be applied to the poems of Hafez, ignoring in the process many indications to the contrary. Some commentators and even some Western translators of Hafez, notably Wilberforce Clark, a translator of the Dīvān, satisfy themselves to the point of utter absurdity that every single word written by Hafez had a mystical meaning, and no line of Hafez actually meant what it said. The reading of Hafez as codified poetry implying an esoteric meaning for each line or word propounded the view that his ghazals can be read at two levels, one apparent, the other hidden, the latter representing the intended meaning. Deciphering Hafez's underlying meaning grew into an esoteric art, not dissimilar to the explanations offered by the addicts of conspiracy theories in political affairs. Then, acknowledging some ambiguity in the application of the term arif, or mystic, to Hafez, Yarshater makes it quite clear that he rejects any significant association of the poet with institutional Sufism. The vehemence of this argument suggests that there is more going on than meets the eye. The objections of Yarshater to Sufi readings of Hafez betray a modernist discomfort with ambiguity and a compulsion to find a correct interpretation. The wholesale dismissal of mystical commentary also fails to recognize how it was applied, and it obscures the argument by demanding that mystical poetry should be composed by a certified mystic, however that may be determined. The first point to clarify is what is meant by mystical commentary. I have argued elsewhere that early Sufi poetry is not a genre, but a hermeneutic. It is not so much poetry written by Sufis as it is poetry read by Sufis. It is notable that one of the most scandalous Arabic poets of the Abbasid era, Abu Nuwas, was a great favorite among Sufis for his brilliant poems on love and wine, though no one could have considered him a saint. In the most prominent context for poetry among early Sufis, listening to music, both the emotional affect and the interpretation were located in the listener, not the poet. This principle was explicit in the Manual of Sufi Practice by Siraj, the Book of Glimmerings, Kitab al-Umma. The reliance and objective in listening to music is according to the goals of the listeners in what they hear, and to the extent of what their consciences encounter from the perspective of what dominates their hearts at times. If they hear something that fits their situation at the time, the secrets of their souls are strengthened by that. They speak from their ecstasy and they point from their intention and their sincerity to that which fits their spiritual state. They do not consider the intention of the poet in his poetry. Let me repeat that. They do not consider the intention of the poet in his poetry. It is the interpretive process that opens a text to mystical understanding. Reflecting on this issue, Jami concluded that it was irrelevant whether Hafez was or was not a Sufi. He said, although it is not known whether Hafez was initiated by a master and had a proper relationship with his group, Still, his poetry is so true to the teaching of this group that no one has any disagreement with it. One of the members of the Naqshbandi order has said, "No Dīvān is better than the Dīvān of Hafez if one is a Sufi." The tradition of mystical commentary was one of many types of commentary that developed in pre-modern Islamic cultures. Thomas Bauer regards the rule of commentary as highly important. The cultures of the Islamic world were shaped, perhaps more than any other cultures, by texts and commentaries and interpretations upon them. He makes this point in the context of a larger argument that pre-modern Islamic culture was characterized by a high tolerance of ambiguity, which allowed and even demanded multiple interpretations of key texts, including the Quran, without any need to insert a single interpretation as the only right one. While this observation may surprise those accustomed to judge Islam by modern extremists, Bauer has made a convincing demonstration of the ample presence of ambiguity in Quranic exegesis, jurisprudence, literature, and many other fields. Thus, commentary functioned as a vehicle for exploring multiple possibilities of meaning that were part of God's beautiful creation. Mystical interpreters of the Quran simply took this principle further, seeking allusions and intimations that could be teased out of the text on the basis of the insights of the Sufis. The major body of Quran interpretations of the early Sufis began with comments on particular verses by Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, collected by the early Sufi Zunnun al-Misri, combined with the sayings of many other mystics in the realities of explanation by Abu Abdurrahman al-Sulami. In Sulami's presentation of each Quranic verse under discussion, he would arrange the comments in no particular order, introducing each one with "so-and-so said," treating each one as an additional insight worthy of reflection. Later commentaries that expanded on Sulami's commentary, compiled by Qushairi and Ruzbahan Baqli, multiplied the perspectives available to the reader without insisting that a single unequivocal meaning should be assigned to each verse. Mystical commentaries eventually served a similar function for poems composed by Sufis. The long Arabic poems by the 13th century Sufis, such as Ibn Arabi and Ibn al-Farid, were often indistinguishable in style and subject from standard court compositions. Ibn Arabi's collection of poems entitled The Translator of Desires was sharply criticized by a Muslim jurist for being excessively erotic, and in response he wrote a lengthy commentary which convinced an assembly that the poems had a spiritual meaning. The translator Michael Sells comments, "Had Ibn Arabi not been known as their author, these might not have been classified as Sufi poems." The mystical interpretation of Ibn al-Farid's poetry has also been explored. The comparison of the interpretation of the Dīvān of Hafez with Quran interpretation is not unreasonable. The status of Hafez within the wider tradition of Islam was discussed by Shihab Ahmed, who asked how it is possible that a poet largely known for a celebration of wine drinking can be considered Islamic in any sense, given the well-known prohibition of wine in Islamic law. Ahmed argues that the collection poems of Hafez constitute a sacred text that must be considered as the Persian equivalent or simulacrum of the Quran, the holy book of Islam. His Dīvān is a key text in the religion of love. It is also worth noting that the poet's pen name, Hafez, indicates that one who has memorized the Quran. His poems contain many quotations and allusions to the Quran. Many Iranian homes display only two books on their table at the Spring New Year festival of the Quran, the Quran and the Dīvān of Hafez. Part of its prominence is indicated by the widespread practice of divination using the Dīvān of Hafez. As Jonathan Z. Smith pointed out, in its most basic sense, a closed text becomes canonical when interpreters apply it to external situations by divination. This kind of divination, bibliomancy, which is also used with the Bible and the Quran, presupposes a scriptural status that makes the canonical text capable of providing knowledge about the unknown future. So there is every reason to regard Hafez as a thoroughly Islamic figure, indeed an extraordinary one. The Sufi biographer Jami said of him, "He is the tongue of the hidden and the interpreter of secrets. He has shown many hidden secrets and meanings of reality in the garment of form and the clothing of metaphor." Next slide. Establishing and historicizing the text of Hafez. The modern development of literary studies in Iran took place under the conditions of the global cultural and political domination of the Middle East by Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. Combined with the creation of a new nation-state under the Pahlavi dynasty in 1925, the responses of Iranian intellectuals were articulated in an atmosphere of nationalism, leading to an emphasis on critical editions of literary and historical texts seen as crucial to the long arc of Iranian history. The recuperation of sources was not, however, accompanied by an analytical evaluation leading to new historical studies, as was happening in the West. as Abbas Amanat has observed. In greater part, such a lacuna was due to the reluctance for critical thinking within disciplines of the humanities, a byproduct, no doubt, of the Pahlavi educational outlook and the superficial positivism that was at its core. The nationalistic mood that emerged with the Pahlavi regime in 1925 soon led to major developments in the image of Hafez. In this process, the ground had been prepared by the publication of A Literary History of Persia, a 4-volume study by British Orientalist E.G. Browne, which had a decisive impact on Iranian intellectuals in its Persian translation. Browne specifically based his history on the model of national literary history found in works on the literary history of the English people. He was not interested in Persian literature as such, but sought to use it as a vehicle for the inner life of the Persians, excluding from his project the extensive Persian literature produced in India and by what he called several branches of the Turkish race. The first major examples of the new conception were the publication in 1927 of Abdurrahim Khalkhali's modern edition of the Dīvān of Hafez, and in 1928 of Hafezology by Abdul Hossein Hajir. Khalkhali lamented the decline of science and knowledge in Iran, specifically singling out Browne as a foreigner who had brought life to the great literary figures of Iran. Hajir described Hafez as the emblem of the manifestation of the Iranian spirit. This was a sentiment that could not even have been conceived a quarter century earlier. In 19th century discussions of Hafez, the concept of Iran as a nation is conspicuously absent, but it has been so successfully drummed into modern Iranian consciousness that it now seems incontestable. What Ali Firdousi calls the new national cult of poetry was also employed to portray Sufism as the expression of Aryan resistance to Semitic imposition of Islam upon Iran by the Arabs. Hafez was now seen as the apotheosis of Iranian national identity. At the same time that Hafez was receiving new attention, the vision of the sweep of Persian literature was being transformed in a nationalistic direction by poet and literary scholar Muhammad Taghi Bahar. He developed a periodization of Persian literature based on stylistic features, divided into the Khorasani style, 11th to 13th centuries, the Iraqi style, 13th to 15th, the Indian style, 15th to 18th, and the return, 18th to 19th. The Khorasani style was typified by the courtly ode, while the Iraqi style features an inward turn to the lyrical ghazal. The Indian style is based on complicated metaphors and abstractions, and the return is a recovery of the simple models of the Khorasani and Iraqi periods. The asymmetrical geographic labels in this chronology contain a polemic against India, for the return movement is seen as only taking place in Iran, while India remains stuck in its artificial style. This model has been challenged in recent scholarship, in part for the nationalistic approach that limits Persian literature to Iran. This exclusion of India from Persian literature is problematic, if only for the reason that the much larger population and wealthier kingdoms of India produce far more Persian literature than Iran proper. The identification of Hafez with Iranian nationalism, combined with the exclusion of non-Iranian cultures from the field of Persian literature, was inevitably infected with the racial views of Aryanism. This created a situation in which only Iranians would be assumed to have a natural understanding of the poetry of Hafez. The focus on critical editions of Persian and Arabic texts has also played a role of overriding importance in modern Iranian scholarship. Indeed, it is something of a misnomer to call the publication of classical texts in Iran critical editions, if by that we mean the methods of establishing critical editions that were developed in classical and biblical studies by scholars like Karl Lachmann in the 19th century. These were based on grouping all manuscripts into a genealogical stemma of families defined by common error analysis. Although Iranian scholars have been aware of this approach, it has hardly ever been applied in Iranian publications. This lack of interest seems partly due to a sense that this European procedure was not appropriate for a literary tradition with its own editorial conventions. Although one of the leading editors of Hafez, Mohammad Ghazvini, spent 35 years in Europe working with scholars like E.G. Browne, he has been defended against the charge of adopting Orientalist methods of editing texts that would call into question his authenticity in terms of Iranian scholarly tradition. The Persian term of art for the editorial process is tashih, meaning correction. The dominant approach in Iran has been a best text approach, based exclusively on the oldest manuscripts, unlike Lachmann's method, which also aims to identify superior copies of recent origin. The text is based on particular copies identified as correct in the editor's judgment, although the criteria for such decisions remain unstated, except for a natural preference for autographs and author-corrected copies. The aim is to recover the author's original creation while remaining blissfully unconcerned with issues of reader reception theory and hermeneutics. The importance that the Iranian government has placed on the production of text editions may be gauged from the establishment of the Written Heritage Research and Publication Center, Miras-e-Maktub, under the Ministry of Islamic Culture and Guidance in 1995. The narrow conception of the recommended editorial process can be seen in the description of the principles articulated in the Official Guide to Correcting Texts. The aim of the science and art of correcting text is to obtain a text as close as possible to the original that issued from the pen of the author, or found expression in the statement of a poet or speaker. The editor is neither a scientific reviser nor a secretary and copyist, but a trustee who attempts to scrub the dust of alterations of scribes and people of past times from the face of the work, and on the basis of an understanding of the life, times, language, and beliefs of the author of the work, in a framework of scientific methods and reliable investigations, produces a text comparable or similar to what the author wrote. This approach to text editing is highly conservative, and it ignores the explosion of new theories of authorship and tools for critical editions that have arisen in recent years. The fixation on recovering the original text of an author collides with an unsolvable problem in the case of Hafez. He did not produce a final authorized collection of his poems during his lifetime, since the practice of assembling one's own collected works was not standard at that time. Therefore, the notion of recreating the original Dīvān of Hafez is a highly speculative enterprise. The oldest and supposedly best manuscripts of Hafez contain numerous variant readings of terms and the number or order of lines, leaving no clear way to recognize the authentic text. At least 1,000 manuscripts containing his poems are preserved in libraries around the world, and it is likely that many other copies exist. While some scholars have called for a critical analysis of all manuscripts to produce a stemma leading to the establishment of the original text, this has not been possible. There is good reason to think that comparing all manuscripts could be a fruitless enterprise. It is relatively common for scribes copying Persian manuscripts to have modernized the style and made other changes that would interfere with the establishment of family relationships between different copies. And there is also the issue of a thriving industry of producing counterfeit Persian manuscripts of astonishingly good quality. Moreover, market conditions in the Iranian publishing industry are not favorable to supporting scholars for the time-consuming collation of manuscripts and tracking errors, as publishers prefer just to get an acceptable issue in the market quickly. Since the first publication of the Dīvān of Hafez in Calcutta in 1791, well over 300 editions of Hafez have appeared in print. Dozens of editions were published in India as lithographs from many different publishers. Probably the most popular Iranian edition has been the 1941 collection, edited by Muhammad Ghazvini and Qasimvani. Nowadays, the preferred edition for reference is that of Parviz Notel Khanlari, of which the third edition was published in 1983. The effort to recover the authentic text of Hafez entailed the positivist attitude to history that was so successfully exported from Europe to the Middle East in the 19th century. The treatment of text as sources of facts that would tell history, quote, as it really happened, unquote, was an enticing new way to read poetry. Attempts have been made to read the ghazals of Hafez as references to contemporary political events in the poet's autobiography. According to Charles de Foucault, the premier French translator of Hafez, the poems of Hafez contain 89 dedications and eulogies addressed by name to the princes and viziers who ruled in Shiraz during his lifetime. However, located as they are in the midst of ghazals which are composed of the timeless themes of love, it is difficult to relate them to the life of Hafez with any confidence. Editors of poetic anthologies all too readily supplied stories that attempted to explain difficult passages with anecdotes that are almost entirely fictional. These attempts at a biographical reading are unconvincing. As Julie Mesame points out, the I of the ghazal functions neither as a grammatical convenience nor as a depersonalized type or universal exemplar, but as a deliberately constituted persona, that of the poet-lover who is simultaneously identified with and distanced from his poem through the agency of the takhalus, the pen name. The presence of this convention, which functions as an explicit declaration of an assumed identity, also decrees that the speaker in the poem cannot be equated with a specific, nameable individual caught in the toils of a factual, literal love affair. That is, the poem is not to be interpreted autobiographically. Nevertheless, the quest for the original text of Hafez has gone hand in hand with attempts to determine who Hafez really was and what he believed based on his poems. The quest to historicize the poems of Hafez appears to be questionable in terms of the high degree of intertextuality his poems possess with the reference to a multitude of previous and contemporary authors. As Leonard Lewison observed, Hardly a verse of Hafez can be found whose sound, form, color, or sense does not hark back to similar lines in the works of numerous earlier poets. The identity of Hafez is obscured by an overriding theme of the poems, a trenchant critique of hypocrisy in all forms. The targets of this attack include judges, Puritan ascetics, preachers, policemen, Sufis, and Hafez himself. In contrast to these posers and pretenders to piety, he applauds Rendi, a quality found in vagabonds, beggars, drunkards, hoodlums, and libertines. They may be sinners, but they are not sanctimonious. Some scholars treat this elevation of nonconformity as an extension of the malamati or self-blaming trend found in some Sufi circles, such as the unruly dervishes known as Commentaries, in which the acknowledgement of sin, real or imagined, is a method for overcoming spiritual pride. But if the confession of sinful activities is tied to the persona of Hafez, then for the historical Hafez, it is bound to be a false confession. As Franklin Lewis put it, Hafez in the end refuses to reveal the real person under his public persona. The complexity of this problem can be illustrated by a prominent example. Bahauddin Khorramshahi, probably the most prolific modern Iranian scholar in the study of Hafez. His publications have been mostly in two fields, the study of the Quran and the study of Hafez. He has published at least 12 books on Hafez. One of them, the Hafez Nameh, a large selection of ghazals with extensive commentary, has gone through 17 printings since its first publication in 1988. Khorramshahi's admiration for Hafez is unbounded. At the conclusion to the introduction to the Book of Hafez, in reply to friends who ask why he does not devote similar attention to any other poet, he replies by listing 12 different ways that Hafez is distinctive. He is a completely attractive example of a thoughtful and intelligent Iranian Muslim, and he explains his role as model in the best manner in his art. So it is that his Dīvān is the book of the heart, the book of the spirit, the soul-revealing mirror, and the Iranian worldview. Hafez is our memory. The first edition of the Hafez Nameh attracted much attention in many reviews, to which Khorramshahi responded in the third printing. The most significant criticism came in a lengthy review from a leading scholar of Sufism, Nasrullah Purjavadi. In addition to questioning Khorramshahi's interpretations of various terms and themes in the poems, Purjavadi argued that Khorramshahi was one of the people who believed that Hafez possessed a kind of intellectual and philosophical schizophrenia, meaning that mystical meaning and mysticism formed one aspect of the poems of Hafez, an aspect that cast its shadow on one portion but not the other. Khorramshahi responded that this criticism amounted to a request to portray Hafez as more religious. He described Hafez as a true Muslim believer, imbued with spiritual and mystical insights, an Ash'arian theology and a Hanafian law with Shi'i sympathies, a series of observations based on scattered references to the poems. He denied having a schizophrenic view of Hafez, and he affirmed the sacred character of the poetry, denying that it is profane. He was using English terms. But Khorramshahi insisted that much of the poetry of Hafez cannot be called mystical. This argument clearly had reached an impasse. The solution adopted by many scholars has been to decide which genre to assign to a poem, such as courtly panegyric, a mystical poem, a love poem, etc. And then in a kind of closed feedback loop, the interpretation is reinforced. In this way, comfortable ambiguities are avoided. Next slide, the growth of Sufi poetry. The mystical commentaries that were aimed at the poetry of Hafez emerged from a hermeneutic that began several centuries earlier. The Arabic poetry that was recited to musical accompaniment in Sufi circles in the 10th and 11th centuries was direct and forceful. While it contained technical terms for the spiritual experiences that the Sufis cultivated, it was not characterized by allegorical interpretation. The same is true of the new poetry in Persian that was emerging at the same time. The Sufi author Hujwiri, who wrote extensively on the practice of listening to music, maintained that its result depended entirely on the attitude and character of the listener. He therefore would not rule that listening to recited poetry was either absolutely forbidden or absolutely permitted. It all depended on the interpretation of the listener. It is from Hujwiri that the first evidence of allegorical readings of poetry was reported in Iran. Without providing any details on the identity of the groups concerned, Hujwiri said that they hold that all poetry is lawful and spend their time listening to love songs and descriptions of the face and hair and mole of the beloved. He condemns them for advocating an esoteric meaning that destroys the external sense, much like the Manichaean heretics of ancient Iran and the Ismailis of the Fatimid Caliphate. A major shift took place when the great theologian and Sufi Muhammad al-Ghazali made the judgment that if the listener takes the words in the sense of a metaphor for divine realities, his listening to music is lawful, but if not, it is forbidden. For Ghazali, poetry was like a mirror in which everyone could see his own image. While critics objected that Sufis listened to the tale of the idol, the tress, the mole, intoxication in taverns, which is forbidden, Ghazali rejected this and complained as ignorance. The important thing was that if the listener was a true lover of God, he would refer everything that he heard in poetry to his divine beloved. Even if the listener heard a poem in Arabic that he did not understand, but from which he nevertheless derived inspiring meanings, that too was not to be rejected. In rhetorical terms, the relationship between poetic symbols and spiritual experience was formulated as the relationship between metaphor and reality. Here too, Ghazali played a major role. Using the example of light, metaphorical light is what makes the visible world accessible to the senses, while real light, which the Quran identifies with God, illuminates spiritual realities. This shared language carries over to the realm of love, so that metaphorical love is a sensory passion between humans, while real love is the love between the human and the divine. Although these two forms of love exist on different existential levels, they are fundamentally connected, according to a widely known Arabic dictum. Metaphor is the bridge to reality. Al-Mujaz qadrat al-haqiqah. The ordinary words employed in love poetry by Sufis were of two kinds: the physical attributes of the beloved's body and the wine imagery of cup, tavern, monastery, and bartender. As Shahab Ahmed pointed out, this hermeneutical perspective on the metaphor and reality was widespread. The subsequent growth of Sufism in Iran in the 12th and 13th centuries led to a remarkable flowering in Persian literature. The prolific writings of the great Sufi poets Sanai, Attar, and Rumi created a vast reservoir of mystical interpretations that took the form of narrative epics as well as lyrical ghazals, not to mention prose treatises on ethics, theology, metaphysics, among other subjects. It was widely accepted that this kind of hermeneutic could be applied to many different genres and subjects. As Rumi put it, it is sweeter if the secret of beloveds is told through stories of other people. While the extent of this tradition is too extensive to summarize here, it may be said that the impact of Sufi ideas, themes, and vocabulary was so pervasive that it was referenced practically everywhere, even among authors who were not mystical at all. The fusion of mystical and philosophical perspectives was evident in the formulation of lexicons of Sufi technical terminology that underpinned the widespread acceptance of this hermeneutic. It is within this context that the commentaries on Hafez need to be understood. A prime example of this Sufi literary approach was The Garden of the Secret, Gulshan-i-Raz by Mahmud Shabastari, a poem in about 1,000 lines written in answer to a series of 15 questions that covered a wide range of Sufi practice and teachings. The contents include explanations of meditation, the unity of existence, knowledge of God, the meaning of the controversial claim of Halaj, and similar topics, drawing extensively on the writings of the influential Andalusian Sufi Ibn Arabi. This treatise was so popular that at least 35 commentaries were written to clarify its meaning. The 15th and final question is devoted to the interpretation of the metaphors found in Sufi poetry, such as the physical attributes of the beloved, wine in the tavern, and unbelief, kufr, and the belt worn by non-Muslims, zanar. This exposition codifies the symbolic interpretation of poetry along mystical lines, creating a hermeneutic that was commonly applied to many literary texts. It has already been mentioned that difficulties in some of the verses of Hafez were explained by stories of colorful incidents in his life. These narratives, abundantly found in literary anthologies, are widely considered to be fictional. Nevertheless, there is one such story about Hafez that is inevitably quoted whenever the subject of India comes up. The first line of the poem begins, Saki, so goes the story of the cypress, the rose, and the tulip. And this conversation goes with 3 purifying cups of wine. The line's references to an unknown story are cryptic, and it also features an unusual end rhyme. Some have maintained that the cypress, the rose, and the tulip are the 3 sons of an Indian king, who is identified in the last line of the poem as Ghiyas-ud-Din. Others noted that the 3 cups of wine could be the 3 servants of the Sultan, who were called upon to act as corpse washers according to Islamic funerary ritual when he thought he was about to die. In this version, courtiers mocked the Sultan until he wrote the first half line of the poem and challenged them to complete it. When they failed, the Sultan sent the verse to Hafez and asked him to complete it. A simpler explanation might be that the poem was a private joke or contest posed to Hafez, which involved composing a poem using unusual words. In any case, the poem states, all the parrots of India will be crunching sugar from this Persian candy that goes to Bengal. Thus, the parrots of India stand for the aristocratic fans of the poetry of Hafez in a remote kingdom, and also the Indian commentators on Hafez. There is no need for the story to be true to make its point. The phrase parrots of India, Tutiyani Hind, has come to be seen as a symbol of the long presence of Persian poetry in India. While that might seem to be a compliment, it leaves India looking like a place where Persian poetry is appreciated but not comprehended. The phrase has come to be seen as a way for Iranians to acknowledge India's engagement with Persian poetry, while at the same time expressing their bemusement and condescension towards the cultural aspirations of the Indians. During the 17th and 18th centuries, there was a strong rivalry between the Safavid Empire in Iran and the Mughal Empire and its successors in India. During that time, claims for India to be the center of Persianate culture were strengthened by the wealth and power of the Indian kingdoms, which drew some of the most talented poets of Iran to seek their fortunes in the subcontinent. But the pursuit of Persian in India went into a swift decline after 1832, when the British colonial rulers of India switched from Persian to English as the language of power. And as we have seen, the emergence of nationalistic sentiment in Iran led to a new historiography of Persian literature, in which Iran made a return to the genuine literary values of its classical period, while India was expunged from this account by the condemnation of the excesses of the Indian style. The mystical commentaries on Hafez posed a problem, since they constituted a major presence in the history of the interpretation of the most admired poet of all. This put modern scholars in a difficult situation in which they felt compelled to show that the Indian commentaries were fundamentally wrong, mainly because of their misguided application of Sufi mystical philosophy to the text of Hafez. Criticism of the Indian commentaries took aim at several different aspects of his poetry. One team of scholars took up a half a dozen poems by Hafez, comparing their interpretations by an Indian commentator with 4 modern Iranian commentators. The Indian commentator interpreted all 6 poems as addressed to the Prophet Muhammad as the Beloved. After 2 poems found in the Indian commentary were set aside as inauthentic, in the remaining 4 poems it transpired that the Iranians identified humans such as political figures as the beloveds addressed in these poems. The authors observe, one of the commentaries written in Persian on the Dīvān of Hafez outside the borders of Iran is from the viewpoint of commentators who view the ghazals of Hafez from a mystical perspective. These commentators have an interpretation of some of the verses of Hafez that apparently none of the Iranian commentators have. Seeking an explanation for this difference, they remark, in some cases and in texts containing mystical expressions, sometimes the complexities imply that perhaps this category, Mysticism, in connection with the quality of the function of the Persian language and its distinctiveness in the subcontinent within limits, naturally takes on a local color. In other words, there's something about the Indian environment that is conducive to an inclination to mysticism. Essentially, the same points are made in another article by the same authors, where they conclude, that which above all is important in knowing the text and understanding it is the special characteristics of influence, especially if a text has been written outside the borders of our country by writers who, in terms of regional knowledge and physical and social environment, differ considerably from the writers inside this country. These authors regard the local color of Indian culture as a factor responsible for mystical interpretation and deviation from the views of modern Iranian scholars. Despite the long history of Persianate literature in the Balkans, Central Asia, and in the Indian subcontinent, readers of Persian from outside the modern borders of Iran are seen as alien to the Iranian culture that defines and is defined by Hafez. Other scholars regard the excessive reliance on mystical interpretation of Hafez as a result of inadequate understanding of his worldview, which should be obvious from a reading of his poems. In a study of the commentaries of Khatmi and Khishigi, 2 scholars make this charge, also pointing to a lack of literary knowledge. They say, ignoring Hafez's worldview is the source of all the objections made against the work of these commentators, while by reflecting on Hafez's poems one can find his intellectual and religious foundation. In addition, the commentators' limited knowledge of literary issues, such as rhetoric and Persian grammar, is the reason for the lack of attention to the literary aspect of Hafez's poetry. While it can be clearly claimed that his poems are among the most literary classical poems of Iran, in the mystical category, sometimes the concentration of this view and the inappropriate use of specific phrases and terms cause the reader to encounter far-fetched meanings that confuse him and prevent him from understanding the real meaning of the poem, while the meaning of the verse itself is more explicit and specific than its interpretation. Therefore, these commentaries can never be responsive to the reader who seeks a correct analysis and explanation of all the literary and mystical points of Hafez's poetry. For these authors, both the character of the worldview of Hafez and the real meaning of his verses are uncontested givens. Some of these scholars have gone further in attempting to diagnose the causes of the inclination towards mystical interpretation among South Asian commentaries. Working off Thomas Kuhn's concept of paradigms and Gadamer's horizon of expectations, the authors of a study of Akbarabadi's commentary on Hafez ask what factors in Indian society were responsible for Akbar-Abadi's understanding of the Dīvān. Their answer to this question is surprisingly a combination of Hinduism and British colonialism. They argue that the widespread existence of polytheism in India created an environment where the religious tolerance and secularism promoted by Hinduism was the norm to an extent unparalleled elsewhere. The religious policies of the Mughal Emperor Akbar are cited as a result. Furthermore, noting that Akbar-Abadi's commentary was written in 1835, a century after the establishment of British colonial rule in India, they observed that this permitted the spread of European scientism and positivism to India. These hypotheses are presented without any evidence to connect them to Akbar-Abadi, and both are intrinsically implausible. The simplistic portrayal of Hinduism as tolerance overlooks a considerable history of religious competition, political engagement, and violent conflict between Indian religious groups. Moreover, to sustain the view that Akbar-Abadi was influenced by this notion of tolerance, one would expect some reference to it in his commentary, especially since there was a large literature on Indian religions available in Persian at the time. However, Akbar-Abadi makes no reference to Hindu thought, and his ecumenism is explicitly phrased in terms of the positive depiction of other religions and Sufi teachings by the school of Ibn Arabi. Regarding the possible impact of British thought, a major problem is the date given for the composition of Akbar-Abadi's commentary, 1835. This is based on the only date known from Akbar-Abadi's life, his move from Agra to Hyderabad in 1150 of the Hijri. That date is in fact equivalent to 1737 of the Common Era. The date of 1835 is the equivalent of 1250 Hijri, indicating a numerical blunder of 100 years. And since the British imposition of power in India did not really begin until the 1770s, the claim of British influence on Akbar-Abadi in 1737 is absurd. Ironically, the authors do not consider the impact of scientism and positivism on Iranian culture. While the commentary of Muhammad Sadiq was written during the British colonial era, his wide experience in Persian literature, linguistics, and Quranic exegesis demonstrate that he was basically continuing the tradition of Hafez commentary that had existed for centuries. There is no trace of British ideas in his commentary either. The use of such flimsy and careless assertions to discredit the Indian commentaries is frequently accompanied by the charge that they are based on defective manuscripts and faulty knowledge of Persian. Such dismissive remarks may indicate an awareness of the weakness of this argument. To conclude, Hafez remains an enduring favorite among readers of Persian poetry. It is not surprising that with his considerable popularity, a tradition of commentary has continued to thrive alongside textual studies of the Dīvān. Yet the cultural and intellectual trajectory of modern Iran has led to a situation in which many commentaries are unreadable. This impasse arises from resistance to the Sufi-inspired mystical readings of Hafez, which had encouraged intertextual interpretations that were multivocal and endlessly inventive. The birth of Persian nationalism redefined Hafez as the epitome of national identity, and this perspective was inflicted with a disdainful attitude that regarded the Indian commentators as deviating from the classical core of Persian literature. The resulting authoritarian view of literary text reinforced the assumption that there can only be one interpretation, only one correct interpretation, which was supposed to be revealing not only the original text, but also the life and viewpoint of the poet, without ambiguity. This quest for unequivocal finality in reading, which privileged those born within the borders of Iran, contrasts oddly with the centuries of conversation among the mystical commentators. The example of Khashoggi, who kept revising his commentaries over the years under 4 different titles, is suggestive of the unending fascination with uncovering new meanings. The dismissal of mystical commentaries on Hafez is symptomatic of a narrowing of intellectual horizons that occurred in modern Iran, as in most other majority Muslim countries that absorbed the academic tools of European culture. It remains to be seen whether a renewed attention to these commentaries will provide the inspiration needed to find new interpretations of the tongue of the hidden. And now we can stop for some Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ernst, for such a thought-provoking lecture. Wonderful. So let's have the Q&A. So as I said, you can either type your question in the chat box or use the Q&A function, or you can also use the raise hand feature to ask questions directly. We have a question here from Amir Amin. The question says, to know that someone is wrong, I must know that I'm correct in my own interpretation of the text. How can I attain certainty about my own righteousness of what Hafez said back in the 14th century, given the inability of the language to convey the intended meaning with certainty?
Well, you can't know what Hafez was thinking. It's not possible. And it's furthermore, the poem stands by itself. It doesn't have an explainer, somebody who's telling you what to think. So it's a chimera. It's an illusion to think that there is something that is the correct interpretation that's waiting for you to find. There are many different interpretations.
Great. Another question it asks, why do they call Hafez Lisan al-Ghaib, or the tongue of the unseen?
Well, the idea is that with the Fali Hafez, the divination, you can use this for divination purposes and Hafez, in effect, knows the future. Now, that's a big assumption. But there are plenty of people who treat Hafez as a way to try to find their inner thoughts. And so they will read a poem and try to connect it to what they think is right. But his poems are so crystal clear that they function as a mirror for the thoughts of everyone who reads them. So it was a term of respect given to him to show how he could be read by so many different readers with great profit.
Right. This question is somewhat, it's a very different kind of question. It's kind of personal too. It's asking, what is your favorite ghazal from the Dīvān of Hafez?
That's a tough one.
Maybe Professor Ernst would prefer not to disclose it here. So
I'll just recite one line.
Sorry, what is the number?
Well, there are different numbers in different editions.
Mathematical attribute.
Go ahead. Sorry, I think
I'll just recite the Persian. دوش دیدم که ملائک در میخانه زدند. گلی آدم بسرشتند و به پیمانه زدند. That's a really nice one.
Indeed. Great. Next question. Disha Rajendra Mishra asked, how do you see the role of cultural and religious beliefs influencing editorial choices, especially when modern readers expect definitive versions?
Well, if an editor is not aware of his or her prejudices and preferences, it's not going to be a very thoughtful edition.
Great.
The current methods of editing text in Iran place a great deal of trust in the experience and judgment of the scholar. And yet they define it as getting it correct, as if it's out there in concrete. So I think there's a lot of assumptions that need to be reconsidered in how to find the real text.
Wonderful. Sorry, did you want to continue, Professor Ernst? Or?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to allude to the well-known fact that many authors were in the habit of revising their writing. So, for instance, there are 4 different versions of a poem by Emily Dickinson. Which is the original one? Which is the one, if you think that there's one that's the authentic one and the others are not, you have a difficult time in establishing it.
Wonderful. The next question, can you please clarify Purjavadi's critique of Khurram Shahi? Yes, that's the question.
Purjavadi said that Khorramshahi was wrong to say that some ghazals are mystical and some are not. Khorramshahi feels that the mystical can be legitimately used throughout. So the poem is not where the meaning lies. The meaning lies in the reader. And that's the fundamental mistake.
Great. This question says, why is Hafez admired so much by people who seem to have so many different belief systems? Like there's a modern contemporary commentary by Ashraf Ali Thanabi from India, who was a Indian Sufi philosopher, theologian, who wrote a commentary on Hafez. On the other hand, we also have Iranian secular intellectuals like Ahmed Shamlu, who also seems to admire Hafez so much. And also even Shiite ulama, religious scholars like Mutahari, also have, or Tabatabai, seem to have a very favorable view of Hafez. Why is this the case with Hafez?
There's also a Marxist interpretation of Hafez.
Yes.
Well, Hafez knew this was going to happen. He says, "On che'uri bepemane ma nushidim, agar che chamre beheshtes o ya bodem ast." Whatever he pours in our cup, we will drink, whether it's the wine of paradise or the drink of drunkenness.
That's really nice. Great. The next question. They say there are two books one should never try to translate, the Quran and the Dīvān of Hafez. Why is that?
Well, it's very difficult. That doesn't stop people from doing it. You can never be satisfied with your own translations.
Great. This is not a question someone is requesting. Kindly share the famous books of Hafez. Well, Hafez just wrote one Dīvān. Sorry, Professor Ernst, please, would you like to comment on this?
Well, he didn't write books. He wrote poems. And they were collected by various other people after his death. So his book, the collected poems of a poet is called a Dīvān, which means a treasury. And there are over 300 printed editions that have been published in the last 200 years. So you can pick and choose.
Right. The next question has to do with Muhammad Iqbal and his own interpretation and a critique of Hafez. So if you have any comments about that, like about the critique of Iqbal on Hafez.
Well, on one occasion he said, "Do not drink the wine of Hafez. It is sweet, but it is full of poison." He argued that mysticism, Sufism, was responsible for the backwardness of Eastern countries under colonialism. And so he considered the poems of Hafez to be a drug that would make people passive. It's a fairly harsh view, and I don't think he really meant it, but he was willing to say that.
Yeah, I also did some research on Iqbal, and it doesn't seem very fair, at least to my limited knowledge. The next question, what is the best known commentary on Hafez's Dīvān?
Well, among the ones that are used in India, there are 4. And 2 of them have been published. Khatmi, Kheshigi, Akbarabadi, and Ghalib Lucknovi. And Actually, I think 3 out of the 4 are available. 2 of those have been published in Iran. But without much engagement. Khurram Shahi helped to edit one of these. And he remarks in the introduction, which is very short, that this commentary by Khatmi is the clearest of the commentaries. He doesn't say if it's good. It might be clearly bad. But he's holding back his judgment. I don't think he's figured out what to do with it.
Interesting. This is probably going to be the last question because we're running out of time. This question is asked by Ahmed, who asked, we know that Salman, who was a court poet and very unlikely to have been a Sufi, lived in the same century as Hafez. Given that the same concept of the Rendi appears in Salman's poetry as well, can we then say that Hafez was not a Sufi?
Well, how do you define what a Sufi is? There's an Arabic saying, a Sufi la yaqulu innahu Sufi. The Sufi does not say he's a Sufi. I think in the end, Hafez has escaped us all. That may be a good ending note.
Yes, for sure. Well, thank you so much, Professor Ernst, for your lecture and for enlightening us with all your insights. So we look forward to seeing everyone in our next lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl, so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you, and farewell.